Hey guys. So as you'll remember, we've been doing kind of a little study going through the life of the Apostle Peter. We've been kind of walking through and hitting some of those big points in Peter's life through the Gospels and through what the Gospel writers tell us about him, specifically as he grows and transforms because of his encounter with Jesus, and he goes from this brash, headstrong, haughty kind of guy, talk with his talks first and thinks later kind of guy. And then he slowly transforms and he grows into one of the people who's going to be one of the founding members and the most important people of the early church growing up. And so we've been kind of like hitting these points throughout the gospel stories, obviously starting with when he was called by Jesus to be a fisher of men. I'm sure you guys remember that. And we talked about how he had to display that his faith and get out of the boat and walk to Jesus on the water. Although, he kind of wavered a bit, his faith kind of was a little shaken when he saw those wind and the waves. But then last week, we talked about Jesus washing his disciples' feet, taking on that role of the servant and what that means for us and what we should be doing as servants of Christ going out. Tonight we're going to talk about something that Jesus says to Peter and a test that his faith is going to go through. It's kind of like a warning. It's kind of a, hey Peter, this is going to happen, so be prepared for it, be ready. But before we really get going into that passage, I want to ask you guys something and just kind of be thinking throughout this message and kind of be thinking back on your life and what you've been through. But have you guys ever gone through some trouble in life? I'm sure we all have. Maybe it's something that really tested your faith and really made you look at everything around you and say, I'm either going to really buy into this or I'm not. Like I said, I'm sure many of us, to all of us, could recall some trying time when our faith really seemed to be at test, really seemed to be tested, where going through it and coming out on the other end have forced us or made us to really grow as a Christian. We had to grow more mature in Christ. We had to grow closer to God in order to get through whatever it was. Like I said, it's gonna be different for each one of us, but all of us have something similar. All of us have a time when our faith was tested or when we had to grow through something to get through some kind of trial in life. That's just a matter of life. So tonight we're going to be looking at a little passage in Luke chapter 22. We're going to just be looking at verses 31 through 34 for this lesson. And this is where Jesus is going to talk to Peter. He pulls him aside and he tells him about his faith and how his faith is about to be tested. He talks about how Satan has gone to God in order to test Peter and his faith, in order to see what Peter's really made of. And these couple of verses are absolutely filled to the brim with hope for the believer. Absolutely filled with hope. Although when you read it, when we first go through it, it might not seem like it. It might not seem like there's a ton of hope and a ton of joy to be found in these verses. But we're going to go through it. We're going to talk about it all, and I hope that you can see that towards the end. And just a little background of these verses before we talk about them. This is going to come right after the Lord's Supper, right after what we talked about last week, where the Lord washes his disciples' feet. They sit down, they have the Lord's Supper. Jesus institutes the communion or the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, all of that stuff is happening. And Jesus, at the end of the meal, is kind of talking to his disciples. You remember last week, we talked about the disciples were arguing amongst themselves over who was greatest, over which was the best disciple and who is going to be seated at the right hand of God. And so it's during this argument that Jesus says this to his disciples, and we're going to talk about it more in depth in the verses to come. But that is right where we're at. The Lord's Supper had just taken place, the Last Supper. Jesus had washed his disciples' feet, gave them this beautiful image of servants. And then they're arguing about who is the greatest amongst themselves. And this is when our passage for tonight takes place. So I'm going to go ahead and turn there real quick. You can follow along with me. It's going to be in Luke chapter 22. We're going to be in verses 31 through 34. Just a couple of verses, but chock full of information. Let me find Luke chapter 22 real quick. All right, so here we go. Luke chapter 22, starting in verse 31, it says, this is Jesus speaking. He says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. And Peter said to him, Lord, I am ready to go with you, both to prison and to death. And Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny me 3 times, or deny that 3 times that you know me. So like I said, this is coming right after Jesus is responding to his disciples who are bickering and arguing amongst themselves over who is the best and who is the greatest disciple. And when they're arguing about who is the greatest, Jesus replies and he retorts this argument that he's hearing amongst themselves. This is going to be right before our passage, but I felt it was kind of good to read it and just get a context. So Jesus' retort, or when he hears them arguing about who is greatest, he says to them, the kings of the Gentiles or exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors, or that's friends of the people. But not so with you. Rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves. For who is greater, one who reclines at the table, or the one who serves? And it is not the one who reclines at the table. Is it not the one who reclines at the table? But I am among you as the one who serves. And so Jesus pretty much tells them, hey, you guys better get ready. There's going to be some massive changes to the status quo, because your ideas of greater or lesser are radically about to change. It's going to be completely turned on its head. And after he says that to everyone, after he warns them, hey, get ready, because who you think is greater, who you think is lesser is about to flip. It's about to be different, because the King of Kings is now taking on the role of the lowest servant. Remember, I was talking about that last week. And then after he says that, he turns to Peter. After he talks to everyone, addresses the crowd, he turns to just Peter and tells him what our text starts with. He says, Simon, Simon, that's Simon Peter's name. Behold, Satan has demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. He pretty much says, hey Peter, the devil has come before God and asked to have you. He asked if he can sift you. And that's pretty intimidating. That's pretty thought-provoking. Pretty much the devil has asked if he can go through Peter and test him to see what he's really made of. To see where his faith really lies and where his trust really lies. And it's using this idea of sifting the wheat, which would have been an ancient practice that these guys would have been super familiar with. Us, probably not so much. But it's where they take the heads of the wheat, which is, the grain or right off the crop, and they put the wheat on this, what's called a threshing floor, which is pretty much a giant concrete flat space. And they put the wheat on this floor, then they trample it, or they get animals to come over and crush it, or however they could to crush this wheat to separate the wheat from the chaff, which is the casing that went around the wheat. Because the chaff is useless, but the wheat is good. It's what you make flour, it's what you make bread out of. And so they'd crush the wheat to be able to separate the grain from the chaff. And then they'd sift it. They'd be able to find a way, to strain it, to sift it, kind of like put it on a giant mesh screen and kind of shake it around so that the wheat would fall through to the ground, but the chaff would remain in the sifter. And so it's a way that they would be able to separate what's good and usable from what's not good, what's not usable, and what needs to be discarded. And this is the imagery, the idea that Jesus is getting at, where he says that Satan is going to sift Peter like wheat. He's going to separate the good from the bad and see what's left. So Satan pretty much has asked God if he could crush Peter and see if his faith is real and if it would hold out. And God said, okay, do it. And so when Peter hears this, naturally, because he's Peter, because he has that attitude, because he's a talk first, think later kind of guy, he responds by saying, Lord, I am ready to go with you both to prison and to death. But Jesus immediately humbles Peter. He immediately shuts him down, and tells Peter, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny me 3 times, or deny that you know me 3 times. And so Jesus tells him, no, Peter, you're not going to go with me to prison. You're not going to go right now with me to death. In fact, before tomorrow hits, you will have denied me 3 times that you even know me, let alone a follower. We all know what happens next. We all know how this story goes. It's a pretty famous one in the life of Peter. We know that Jesus is pretty soon arrested in the garden, and that all of his disciples flee him, including Peter. And when Jesus is being flogged and getting ready to be crucified, Peter is asked by 3 separate people, hey, don't you know that guy? Aren't you a follower of that Jesus? And all 3 times, Peter denies even knowing Jesus. And immediately after that 3rd time, he hears that rooster crow and he breaks down. He starts falling in the street, sobbing and weeping and mourning, because he breaks over that, because he realizes Jesus was right, that he just denied him 3 times. He was sifted, and it hurt. And sifting does hurt sometimes. It does hurt. And this whole idea of Satan going to God to see if he can sift people of God, I don't think it's reserved for only Peter. We know of another time in the Old Testament, in the book of Job, where we see Satan going to God, asking if he could have Job, and asking essentially if he can sift him, asking if he can test him to see if he takes away all this good stuff that Job has, if Job's really going to follow God or not. It's almost the same exact thing that happens here, where Satan goes to God and asks, hey, can I test this person? Can I sift him? Can I go through him? Can I break him down? Can I see if his faith is genuine? And I don't think, again, it's limited to those 2 guys. I think in our life, too, Satan goes to God on behalf of God's people and asks to sift us. Even today, he goes and he asks to test our faith. Because we know we all go through trials. Jesus himself tells us that we're going to have trials in this life. And I think that when those trials come, although they may hurt, they may seem to break us, but just like the wheat has to be trampled in order to be sifted and used for good, sometimes our faith needs to weed out what's bad so that the good can flourish, kind of like weeding out a garden. Because if we go through these trials faithfully, then our faith is going to grow. And even though those trials are coming, we can be stronger and better on the outside of them. And at the beginning of this lesson, I said that this was a passage filled with hope. It was filled with optimism and joy. And you might be asking yourself, talking about Peter being broken and being sifted and being hurt, and us probably maybe going through something similar where we may be sifted and we may be tested and it may hurt. You may be asking, where's that optimism and where's that hope? And that comes in our passage, in what Jesus tells to Peter. Like we talked about, he had warned Peter saying, hey, Satan has demanded to have you so that he may sift you like wheat. But then look at what he says right after that. He says, Satan demanded to have you that he might sift you, but I, being Jesus, have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. Peter is going to face a serious trial coming up here. Satan is going to sift Peter like wheat to see what's good, to see what is actually true and genuine in his faith. Satan is about to test Peter, but Jesus is praying on his behalf. Because of Jesus, he tells him, your faith is not going to fail you. Even though this may hurt, even though this may be a huge struggle for you to have to push through, your faith will not fail. I am praying for you. I have prayed for you, Peter. And even us, when we're going through trials, it may seem difficult, it may hurt, it may seem bad, real bad at the time. But even now, every single day, Jesus is interceding for us too. And that if we're faithful going through the trials, and if we continue to look towards him for that goodness and that praise and the thing that will get us through the trials, and our faith will grow too. Peter, after the story takes place, after Peter is broken and possibly at his lowest point denying Jesus, He goes on to be the man who preaches to over 3,000 people at Pentecost, who becomes a huge leader and founder of the early church. And without Peter, we may not even be here today. And that's coming and that's growing from that point of brokenness, from that point of sifting. Peter grows through the grace of God into this leader and this man who helps lead the church. And us, when we go through these trials that may hurt and may break us down a little bit, it is necessary that we can grow through them and grow to be more mature and better Christians at the end by God's grace. And like Peter's told here, we have Jesus interceding and praying and encouraging us and building us up through these trials. And so I pray that as you guys go through trials in life and as you're kind of being sifted and your faith is kind of being pushed to its limits and tried, especially during this year with everything that's going on, especially during 2020, I pray that your faith isn't broken in these trials, but instead is made stronger through them. That, like James tells us in the book of James, that we will grow through these trials in life. Like I say, not just go through trials, but grow through them. And that your faith in Jesus is going to be more firmly planted in Him and in His Word and in His people. And I hope that these trials don't break your faith, but make them stronger and make you a better and stronger Christian. And the only way that we're going to do that is by faithfully pursuing Him through these trials and through these siftings that we go through in life. And like Peter is told here at the very end, when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. When you go through those trials and you get to the other end and you are a bigger and better and more mature Christian because of them, find your brothers and your sisters who are smack dab in the middle of those trials and those problems and help carry them through that. Help build up the family of believers, help strengthen each other. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. Find someone who's going through these trials now, these trials that you have already gone through and you have already grown and learned the lessons. Find someone going through them and help strengthen and build them up so that their faith too will be made stronger through the trial and won't break. Be that Christian community that we all need. And so that's my hope, that's my prayer for you guys, is that we can look at the passage of Peter being sifted like wheat. We can look at that warning. We can know that his faith was hurt, but it wasn't broken. And because of it, he was able to grow and be a better and stronger leader for the church. And for you guys, when you're going through those trials in life, I hope that you faithfully pursue God through them and in the storm and in the middle of whatever's going on, and know that He is good. He has a plan and a purpose for these trials that you're going through. And hope that you faithfully pursue Him through His Word, through prayers, through praise, and that your faith is made stronger through the trials. And you are more mature and stronger and deeper in love with God than you were when you were going into these trials. Use these trials as a growing tool for you and grow through them. Don't just go through them. Thank you guys. I'm praying for you each and every day. If there's something specifically that I could pray for you, please let me know. Shoot me a text or give me a call. That's what I'm here for. Appreciate you guys joining us for this little Bible study, and I hope you guys got something out of it. You have a great night.